My blood turned to ice as I sat in my car in the pickup line, the leather steering wheel suddenly feeling slick beneath my palms, despite the autumn chill in the air that had seemed so pleasant just moments before when I'd been listening to the radio and thinking about what to make for dinner. The afternoon sun was still bright overhead, casting long shadows across the school parking lot where other parents were collecting their children, laughing and chatting about soccer practice and piano lessons, completely unaware that my entire world had just shattered in the space of 7 words that kept repeating in my mind like a broken record. Ms. Castillo was still smiling, holding her clipboard like this was completely normal, like she hadn't just delivered the most terrifying news a parent could hear, like my face hadn't gone completely pale and my breathing hadn't become shallow and rapid. Her expression was pleasant, almost cheerful, the kind of routine friendliness teachers maintained during the chaos of dismissal time, that practice smile they gave to every parent as they checked names off their lists and sent children on their way. She had the custody paperwork and everything, said you two worked out a new arrangement. The words echoed in my head, each syllable feeling surreal and impossible, like something from a nightmare I couldn't wake up from no matter how hard I tried. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, the pain in my fingers barely registering as my mind raced through the impossibility of what I'd just heard, trying to make sense of something that made absolutely no sense at all. That's impossible. My ex-wife Tara has been in federal prison for 18 months, and I have full custody. Our daughter Nora hasn't seen her since the trial. My voice came out strained, tight with rising panic that I struggled to contain, the words tumbling over each other as I tried to explain the situation that should have been prevented by every security measure the school had in place. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribcage, each beat seeming to shake my entire body, the adrenaline flooding my system making my hands shake and my vision narrow to a tunnel. I fumbled for my phone with trembling hands, nearly dropping it twice before managing to pull up the documents I kept stored for exactly this kind of emergency, though I'd never actually imagined I'd need them like this, never thought that the worst-case scenario I'd prepared for would actually come to pass. I showed Ms. Castillo the custody order, the one that explicitly states I'm the sole guardian, the one that has Tara's mugshot attached for security purposes, the official court seal embossed at the top, the judge's signature clear and authoritative at the bottom. The teacher's face drained of color as she stared at the screen, her eyes widening with dawning horror as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened, as the implications of her mistake became crystal clear. Oh my God. But she knew Nora's middle name, her birthday, what she had for lunch yesterday. She had documents. Her voice rose with each word, the clipboard clattering to the pavement as her hands flew to her mouth, her whole body beginning to shake as the reality set in. I was already dialing 911 while running toward the main office, my legs feeling weak beneath me, but somehow still carrying me forward through sheer force of adrenaline and paternal terror, my phone pressed to my ear as I heard the emergency operator answer. The principal met us at the door, her professional composure cracking the moment she saw our faces, the color draining from her own cheeks as Ms. Castillo stammered out what had happened, and within minutes, 3 police cars were in the parking lot, their lights painting the brick facade of the school in alternating flashes of red and blue that drew curious stares from the remaining parents and students. The security office was cramped and smelled like burnt coffee, the kind that had been sitting on a hot plate for hours, mixing with the scent of old carpet and the principal's floral perfume in a way that made my already churning stomach worse, the combination of odors making me feel lightheaded and nauseous. The walls were lined with monitors showing various angles of hallways, playgrounds, and entrances, all of them utterly useless now that my daughter was already gone, spirited away while the cameras had recorded every moment of her abduction without anyone realizing what was happening. The principal pulled up footage from today with shaking hands, her fingers fumbling over the keyboard as she scrolled back through the hours, muttering apologies and explanations that I barely heard over the roaring in my ears. And there she was. A woman in a surgical mask and sunglasses, signing Nora out with practiced confidence, her movements smooth and unhurried like she had every right to be there. The way she walked, the gestures, even how she tucked her hair behind her ear, it looked exactly like my ex-wife Tara, every mannerism captured perfectly, as if I were watching Tara herself on that grainy footage. Every movement was precise, familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, the resemblance so uncanny that I understood completely how Ms. Castillo had been fooled, how anyone who knew Tara would have been convinced. But Tara was locked up 3 states away, behind concrete walls and razor wire, her freedom taken by a judge who'd thrown the book at her for embezzlement and fraud, sentencing her to 5 years in a federal facility where she was supposed to be safely contained. I called the prison while the detective reviewed more footage, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone to my ear, my voice breaking as I asked to confirm Tara's current location. The automated system seemed to take forever. Each recorded message and menu option, another eternity of not knowing where my little girl was, each second stretching out into what felt like hours. After 12 agonizing minutes on hold, listening to tinny classical music interrupted by reminders about visiting hours and commissary deposits, a guard confirmed it. Tara is still in her cell. The words should have brought relief, should have answered at least one question, but instead they only deepened the mystery and amplified my fear, raising more questions than they answered. My hands were shaking now as I watched the woman on screen lead my 8-year-old daughter to a white Toyota Camry, the footage grainy but clear enough to see every devastating detail, to see Nora's trusting face and bouncing pigtails. Nora was laughing, swinging her backpack, completely trusting this stranger who had somehow perfectly mimicked her mother, who she hadn't seen in a year and a half, but would still recognize anywhere, whose face still appeared in the framed photos Nora kept on her nightstand, despite everything that had happened. The detective zoomed in on the license plate, his jaw set in grim determination, his years of experience evident in the methodical way he worked through the footage. Rental car, paid cash this morning under the name Roxanne. Then he pulled up traffic cameras, tracking the vehicle's route through the city streets with methodical precision, following the white Camry as it wove through afternoon traffic. The car had driven north toward the interstate, each frame showing my daughter getting farther and farther away from safety, the distance growing with every passing second that we spent reviewing footage and gathering information. Every second that passed felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest, the air in the cramped office feeling too thin, too warm, suffocating in its inadequacy, making it hard to breathe or think clearly. The detective's phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the tense silence that had fallen over the room as we all watched the monitors with mounting dread. "We've got them on I-95, heading toward the state line." I was already running to my car when the principal shouted, "Wait, we found something else." She held up the sign-out form, the paper trembling in her grip, her face still pale with shock and guilt. The handwriting was perfect, identical to Tara's distinctive loops and slants, the signature that I'd seen on 1,000 documents during our marriage and divorce, on birthday cards and grocery lists and legal papers. But there was a phone number I didn't recognize scrawled at the bottom in the emergency contact field, the digits written in the same careful hand. The number belonged to a burner phone purchased yesterday at a gas station 40 miles away, the detective informed me after running it through his system. The phone bought with cash and activated just hours before the abduction. While the detective ran a trace, trying to triangulate any recent signals, trying to find any digital footprint that might lead us to Nora, I called Tara's lawyer, the one who'd defended her and lost, the one who'd argued for leniency and gotten nowhere with the stone-faced judge, the one who still took her calls from prison. "Has Tara been in contact with anyone unusual?" I asked, my voice hoarse with stress and fear, desperation making me reach for any possible connection. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a hesitation that made my stomach drop even further, that told me the lawyer was weighing what to say. "Actually, yes. She mentioned her cellmate got released last month, Diane Watts. They were close, too close if you ask me. Tara was always talking about how Diane understood her, how they were going to stay in touch." The words tumbled out in a rush now that the lawyer had made the connection, the pieces falling into place. The detective's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up records and files with practiced efficiency, his face growing darker as he read through Diane's criminal history. Diane Watts. Armed robbery, forgery, assault. Released 4 weeks ago. Her parole officer hadn't heard from her in 2 weeks, a violation that should have triggered alarms, but had somehow slipped through the cracks of an overburdened system. Another failure in a chain of failures that had led to this moment. Then the pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity, the picture becoming horrifyingly clear. The detective pulled up Diane's booking photo and held it next to the security footage, his screen split between the two images, the resemblance undeniable. Same height, same build, similar bone structure that with the right wig and makeup could pass for Tara, especially to someone who'd only met her a few times. She studied Tara for 10 months in that cell and replicated her mannerisms perfectly, he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief at the calculated nature of the deception, at the patience and planning that had gone into this crime. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, the vibration making me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. "If you want to see Nora again, wire $50,000 to this account. You have 2 hours. No police or she disappears forever." Attached was a photo of Nora eating ice cream, chocolate smeared on her chin, still in her school uniform, looking happy but confused, her innocent face a knife to my heart, proof of life that somehow made everything worse. The detective was already coordinating with state police, calling in resources and setting up roadblocks, his voice steady and authoritative as he gave orders and requested backup. But I knew what this really was, could see the pattern emerging from the chaos, Could see Tara's fingerprints all over this plan. This wasn't random. This was Tara, orchestrating everything from her cell, using Diane as her weapon, manipulating and scheming even from behind bars, reaching out through the walls to hurt me one more time. They tracked Roxanne down to a motel on the outskirts of a small town, a run-down place with peeling paint and flickering neon that cast sickly colors across cracked pavement. But the ride there made me feel so nervous that I threw up twice, once in a gas station bathroom and once on the shoulder of the highway, my body rebelling against the stress and fear coursing through my system, the terror of not knowing if I'd see my daughter alive again. Through the walls of her room, thin as paper and smelling of cigarette smoke and mildew that seeped into everything, we heard Diane on the phone with Tara in prison. "The kid keeps asking questions. You said he'd pay immediately." Tara's voice was cold even through the tinny speaker. "Stop being weak. He destroyed my life. Now we destroy his." The venom in her words was chilling, the hatred still burning bright after all this time, undiminished by months in prison or the passage of time. When officers moved in, their boots heavy on the walkway, their tactical gear making soft rustling sounds in the growing darkness, Diane saw them through the window and grabbed Nora, pulling her inside with a desperate, panicked movement that made my heart stop. "Tara promised me 50,000. She said you had millions hidden," she screamed through the door, her voice cracking with hysteria and dawning realization that she'd been used, that the promises had been lies. The negotiator stepped forward, trained and calm, his voice smooth and practiced, but I pushed past him, my paternal instinct overriding protocol and common sense, knowing that I had to try. "Diane, she's using you. There's no money. I barely have enough to get by as is." The truth of it rang in my words. The reality of single parenthood and legal fees and starting over, the financial struggles that had come from rebuilding a life after Tara's crimes. Silence fell, heavy and fraught. Then sobbing began inside the room, broken and anguished, the sound of someone's world crumbling. For 20 minutes we waited while Diane fell apart inside, the sound of her crying mixing with Nora's small voice asking why Aunt Diane was crying, why the police were outside, where was Daddy, each question a fresh torment to my soul, each innocent query making me want to break down that door myself. Finally the door opened slowly, creaking on rusted hinges, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the tense silence. Diane stood there, mascara streaming down her face in black rivers, holding the forged papers Tara had spent months teaching her to create, every detail perfect because Tara had coached her through 10 months of shared prison meals, yard time, lights-out whispers. Update. Officers rushed forward with practiced efficiency, their boots pounding the concrete walkway as they surrounded Diane with weapons lowered but ready, voices calm and commanding as they told her to drop the papers and put her hands where they could see them. I didn't wait for their clearance, couldn't wait another second, my body moving on pure instinct as I pushed past the tactical team and lunged toward the doorway where my daughter stood just inside the room looking small and scared, and so incredibly precious. Nora saw me and her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks as she broke free from Diane's loose grip, and ran into my arms with a force that nearly knocked me backward, her small hands grabbing fistfuls of my shirt as she buried her face against my chest. She was asking why everyone was crying, why the police were here, if she was in trouble for leaving school with Aunt Diane, her words tumbling out in a rush between hiccuping sobs that made my own throat close up with emotion I struggled to contain. The relief hit me like a physical blow, so intense and overwhelming that my legs buckled beneath me, and I sank to my knees on the rough concrete with Nora still clutched tight in my arms, my hands running over her hair and back to confirm she was real and solid and safe. She smelled like chocolate and cheap motel soap, her pigtails were coming loose and there was ice cream dried on her uniform collar. But she was here, and whole, and alive, and nothing else mattered in that moment as I held her and tried to stop shaking long enough to reassure her that everything would be okay. Behind us, officers were handcuffing Diane while she sobbed and apologized, her mascara-streaked face a mess of regret and confusion as they read her rights and secured the scene with efficient movements that barely registered through the roaring in my ears. Detective Carlson appeared beside us, his large hand gentle on my shoulder as he spoke in a low voice about needing to get Nora checked out by paramedics, about making sure she wasn't hurt or drugged or traumatized beyond what we could see on the surface. I nodded without really hearing him, still running my hands over Nora's arms and legs like I could find some injury I'd missed, some sign that this nightmare had left permanent damage on my little girl. The detective helped me stand, supporting my elbow when my legs wobbled and guided us toward the ambulance that had pulled into the parking lot with lights flashing but no siren, the red and white colors painting the dingy motel in garish brightness. Nora clung to my neck with both arms wrapped tight, her legs around my waist like she used to do. When she was smaller, when she still believed I could protect her from anything scary in the world, before Tara's arrest had shattered that innocent trust. Detective Carlson separated us gently but firmly once we reached the ambulance, his voice kind but professional, as he explained that the paramedics needed space to examine Nora properly, that I could hold her hand but needed to let them work. Through the open motel room door behind us, I could see the burner phone still on the nightstand, its screen glowing with an active call that must have been Tara listening to everything, hearing her plan fall apart in real time, and the sight made fresh anger surge through my chest, hot and bitter. Nora kept repeating my name over and over, her small voice high and scared as she reached for me even, while the paramedics tried to check her pulse and look in her eyes with their little flashlight, asking her questions about whether anything hurt or if she felt sick or dizzy. Officers were leading Diane past us toward a patrol car, and she turned her tear-stained face in our direction, words spilling out in a desperate rush about how she never meant to scare Nora, how she thought this was just about getting money Tara said we owed her, how she believed everything Tara told her about me being the bad guy who stole from her and turned her daughter against her. I turned away from Diane's apologies, unable to process her excuses when all my focus needed to stay on Nora, on making sure my daughter understood she was safe now and hadn't done anything wrong. The paramedics worked quickly, their hands gentle as they examined Nora's pupils and listened to her heart, asking her simple questions about whether she'd eaten or drunk anything unusual, whether Diane had given her any medicine or made her feel sleepy. Nora seemed physically fine, but kept asking questions that broke my heart, wanting to know if Aunt Diane was going to jail like her mom, if she was in trouble for going with someone without asking me first, if I was mad at her for not knowing something was wrong. I struggled to find words that would explain what happened without making her more scared, trying to balance honesty with age-appropriate information, while the paramedics finished their examination and gave me a thumbs up that she appeared unharmed. Detective Carlson approached with his notepad ready, his pen already uncapped as he asked if he could get Nora's statement about what happened today, about what Diane said and did and where they went together. I stopped him immediately, my voice firm despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle as I insisted we needed to wait for a child psychologist, that Nora had already been through enough today and needed someone trained to interview traumatized kids without making things worse. The detective nodded understanding and put his notepad away, radioing for a specialist to meet us at the station. And I felt grateful that he didn't push back or argue about procedure when my daughter's well-being was clearly more important than getting a statement right this second. We drove to the police station in the back of Detective Carlson's unmarked car, Nora pressed against my side with her head on my shoulder, and her hand gripping mine so tight my fingers went numb, but I didn't move or adjust my position because she needed that physical connection to feel secure. The station was busy with evening shift change, officers moving through hallways with coffee cups and paperwork, their voices a low buzz that made Nora press closer against me as we walked through the building following Detective Carlson's broad back. 2 hours crawled by while we waited in a comfortable interview room with soft chairs and toys scattered across a low table, the kind of space designed to put scared kids at ease with its warm lighting and cheerful posters on the walls. A woman named Mariana Aguirre finally arrived, introducing herself as a child specialist who worked with the police department to interview young witnesses and victims, her voice gentle and her smile genuine as she knelt down to Nora's level and explained what they were going to talk about. I watched through the one-way glass as Mariana worked with incredible patience, using dolls and drawing materials to help Nora feel comfortable enough to share what happened, never pushing or leading, but letting my daughter tell the story at her own pace. Nora explained how Aunt Diane knew everything about her life, all her favorite foods and the names of her stuffed animals, and even the special song her mom used to sing at bedtime before she went away. She described the ice cream they'd gotten, chocolate chip mint in a waffle cone, and how Diane told stories about being her mom's best friend in prison, about all the things they talked about and planned together. Nora said Diane promised they would see her mom soon if she was good, and didn't ask too many questions, that this was a special secret surprise that would make everyone happy if Nora just trusted her and went along with the plan. My daughter's innocent face as she recounted these manipulations made me want to put my fist through the glass. The casual way Tara had weaponized every detail of Nora's life to make this abduction possible, filling me with rage I had to swallow down because falling apart wouldn't help anyone right now. Detective Carlson stood beside me during the interview, and when Mariana finished and brought Nora back to me, he led me to a different room where evidence from Diane's motel was spread across a table in clear plastic bags. There was a spiral notebook filled with detailed information about our daily routines, what time I left for work and came home, what days Nora had soccer practice, what route we took to the school every morning, all written in Diane's careful handwriting with dates going back weeks. Printed photos of Nora were paperclipped to several pages, pictures taken from a distance showing her at the playground or walking into school or playing in our front yard. And the realization that someone had been watching us for so long made my skin feel cold and crawly like insects were running across my back. Detective Carlson pointed out entries that referenced Tara's instructions, notes about how to style the wig to match her hair exactly, what kind of sunglasses she preferred, the specific way she signed her name with that distinctive loop on the capital T. The level of planning was incredible and terrifying, showing that Tara had been working on this scheme probably since the day she met Diane in prison, grooming her cellmate with stories and lies and promises of money that never existed. I realized Tara must have started planning this the moment she learned Diane would be released before her, seeing an opportunity to hurt me through the one person I loved most in the world, and the calculated cruelty of it made me feel sick all over again. In the interrogation room next door, visible through another window, Diane was giving her confession with a lawyer sitting beside her, who barely said a word as she poured out everything about how Tara had recruited her. She explained that Tara spent 10 months teaching her mannerisms and speech patterns and family history, drilling her on details until she could pass as Tara to anyone who didn't know her intimately. Diane said Tara promised that my ex-wife's wealthy family would pay them both $50,000 once they got Nora back, and exposed my supposed parental alienation, that this was about reuniting a loving mother with her stolen child while getting justice for financial crimes I'd supposedly committed. She'd believed every word of Tara's story about me being a manipulative thief who'd turned Nora against her mother, and hidden money that belonged to both of them, and Diane thought she was helping right a terrible wrong while earning enough money to start her life over after prison. The federal prosecutor arrived during Diane's confession, a sharp-eyed woman in a navy suit who introduced herself and immediately started talking about jurisdiction issues since Diane had crossed state lines with Nora. Agent Valentina Moore from the FBI joined the meeting minutes later, her credentials impressive as she explained they'd be adding charges against Tara for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, using a communication device to facilitate a felony, and potentially witness tampering if they could prove she coached Diane on deceiving authorities. The prosecutor assured me they were taking this extremely seriously and would seek the maximum additional sentence for Tara, that using your own child as a weapon in a revenge scheme from prison demonstrated a level of depravity that demanded harsh consequences. I took Nora home near midnight, after all the statements and examinations were finally complete, and she fell asleep in the car still clutching her backpack like it was the only familiar thing in a world that had suddenly become strange and scary. Carrying her inside our house, I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before, how the bushes near the windows could hide someone watching, how the street lamp didn't quite reach our front door, how easy it would be for someone to stand in the shadows and observe our lives without us ever knowing they were there. The house didn't feel safe anymore, not when Diane had photos of it and knew our routines and had probably stood right outside taking pictures while we ate dinner or watched TV completely unaware of the danger. I carried Nora upstairs but couldn't bring myself to put her in her own room, the distance feeling too far, and the darkness too complete. So I laid her in my bed still fully dressed except for her shoes and pulled the covers up around her small sleeping form. I spent the night sitting in the chair beside the bed watching her sleep, my mind racing through everything that could have gone wrong today, all the ways this could have ended with my daughter hurt or dead or disappeared forever into some nightmare I couldn't wake her from. Every time she stirred or made a sound, my heart jumped, and I leaned forward to make sure she was still breathing, still safe, still here with me where she belonged. The next morning, sunlight came too bright through the windows, and Nora woke up slowly, her eyes confused as she looked around my bedroom before focusing on my face with a question already forming. She asked if yesterday really happened or if it was just a bad dream, her voice small and hopeful, like maybe if she wished hard enough it could all be erased, and I had to gently confirm it was real while pulling her into my arms and promising she was safe now. She wanted to know if her mom was mad at her for not going with Aunt Diane willingly, for crying, and asking questions instead of being excited about the surprise, and the question absolutely destroyed me because it showed how deeply Tara's manipulation had confused Nora's understanding of love and loyalty and what a parent should want for their child. We spent the morning on the couch watching cartoons, Nora pressed against my side with my arm around her shoulders, while I tried to figure out how to explain that her mother had done something very wrong without making Nora feel responsible or guilty for existing as the weapon Tara chose to use against me. My phone rang around 10, the principal's name flashing on the screen, and I answered to hear Weston Brand apologizing over and over in a voice thick with guilt and horror at what had happened at his school. He wanted to schedule a meeting about the security failure that had allowed Diane to sign Nora out despite the custody order on file, explaining that the school board was conducting a full review of their release procedures and implementing immediate changes to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. He told me that Ms. Castillo had taken emergency leave because she was so upset about her role in the abduction that she'd been crying in the principal's office for an hour after the police left yesterday, completely broken by the realization that she'd handed a child over to a kidnapper. I felt angry at the system that had failed us so completely, furious that all the custody orders and security measures had been worthless when it mattered most. But I also understood that Diane's impersonation had been sophisticated enough to fool anyone who didn't know Tara intimately, and the forged documents had looked completely real down to the embossed court seal and judge's signature. I understand completely. I'll write the continuation covering beats 11 to 20 as a single continuous paragraph with proper sentence structure, 25 to 30 word maximum per sentence, maintaining 6th grade vocabulary, keeping dialogue under 5%, focusing 97% on action, and ensuring seamless continuation from the previous content. Detective Carlson called my phone around noon that same day, while Nora was napping in my bed. Her small body finally relaxed after the tension of the morning, and his voice was tight with barely controlled anger as he explained what the prison investigation had found. They discovered that Tara had been paying off a guard named Mitchell for the past 8 months, slipping him cash from her commissary account that her parents had been funding before they cut her off. And Mitchell had been smuggling her a basic flip phone that she kept hidden in her cell behind a loose brick in the wall. The phone records showed dozens of calls to Diane starting 2 weeks before her release, coaching sessions that lasted hours, where Tara taught her every detail about our family, our routines, Nora's personality and preferences, even the specific way I signed my name on the school forms. Mitchell was already in custody facing federal charges for corruption and smuggling contraband into a prison facility. And Tara had been moved to solitary confinement in a different wing, where she'd have zero contact with other prisoners and no chance to manipulate anyone else into doing her dirty work. Carlson said the FBI was building a case against her for conspiracy and using communication devices to commit felonies, charges that could add 10 or 15 years to her sentence on top of the embezzlement time she was already serving. I thanked him for the update and hung up feeling a grim sort of satisfaction that Tara's scheming had finally caught up with her in a way she couldn't talk or manipulate her way out of. But the satisfaction faded fast when I looked at Nora sleeping and realized no amount of additional prison time would undo the fear and confusion my daughter had experienced. I spent that afternoon researching family lawyers while Nora colored at the kitchen table, her crayons moving across the paper in careful strokes as she drew pictures of our house with both of us standing in front of it, always just the two of us with no third person in her family portraits anymore. By evening, I'd scheduled a meeting with someone named Patricia Chen, who specialized in custody cases and parental rights termination, and her assistant said she'd reviewed my initial email and wanted to meet as soon as possible given the seriousness of what had happened. The meeting happened 2 days later in her office downtown, a space with warm lighting and comfortable chairs that felt less intimidating than I'd expected, and Patricia listened to the whole story without interrupting while taking notes on a yellow legal pad. She explained that terminating parental rights was really hard to achieve in most cases because courts believed strongly in keeping family connections even when parents made mistakes, but using your own child as a weapon in a revenge scheme from prison was so far beyond normal parental mistakes that we had a strong case for proving Tara was unfit and dangerous. We'd need to gather documentation of everything: the police reports and FBI investigation files and testimony from Dr. Aguirre about the psychological harm to Nora, plus my own accounts of Tara's behavior before and after her arrest that showed a pattern of manipulation and disregard for our daughter's well-being. Patricia said the process would take months and require multiple court appearances, but she believed we could win and give Nora the legal protection she deserved from a mother who'd proven she'd hurt her own child to get revenge on me. I signed the paperwork to retain her services and left feeling like I was finally taking real action to protect Nora permanently instead of just reacting to whatever Tara threw at us next. 3 days after we brought Nora home from the motel, the nightmares started with a scream that jolted me awake at 2 a.m, my heart racing as I ran to my bedroom where she was thrashing in the sheets and crying. She was still asleep but clearly trapped in some horrible dream, her small voice calling for me over and over. And when I finally woke her up, she clung to my neck sobbing and saying she dreamed that Aunt Diane had taken her away and she couldn't find me no matter how hard she looked. I held her and rocked her like I used to when she was tiny, whispering that she was safe and I was right here and nobody was taking her anywhere. But the fear in her eyes didn't fully fade even after she calmed down. The nightmares came back the next night and the night after that, different versions of the same basic terror of being separated from me. And unable to get back home, and by day she became clingy in a way she hadn't been since she was a toddler, following me from room to room and panicking if I went outside to get the mail without telling her first. Dr. Aguirre squeezed us in for an emergency session when I called her office and explained what was happening, and she told us both that Nora's reaction was completely normal for a child who'd experienced what she had, that her brain was trying to process the trauma through dreams, and her anxiety about my whereabouts made sense because her sense of safety had been broken. She recommended therapy twice a week for the next few months to help Nora work through the fear and rebuild her feeling of security, using play therapy and art therapy techniques designed for kids her age who'd been through scary experiences. I agreed immediately, even though I had no idea how I'd pay for it all, the bills from just this one emergency session making me wince. When I saw the number, but Nora's mental health was worth any amount of money or debt I'd have to take on. Principal Brand called that same week to schedule a meeting about the security changes they were putting in place. And when I arrived at the school the following Tuesday, he had a whole presentation ready showing the new protocols they'd developed with input from the police department and school district security experts. Every person picking up a child would now have to show photo ID that staff would verify against a database of approved adults. And anyone on a custody alert list like ours would trigger a two-person verification system where both the teacher and another administrator had to approve the release. They were training all staff on how to spot forged documents and what red flags to look for. Things like mismatched fonts or blurry court seals or signatures that didn't quite match the ones on file. Brand apologized again for what happened, his face showing genuine guilt and regret, and he explained that these protocols should have been standard practice all along, but the school board had resisted the changes because of concerns about slowing down dismissal times. I told him I was glad they were finally taking security seriously, but angry that it took my daughter being kidnapped to make them act, that other parents shouldn't have to go through what we did before schools protected their kids properly. He nodded and said he understood my frustration and promised these changes would protect not just Nora, but every child in the building going forward, and I left feeling grateful for the new safety measures, but still mad that common-sense security had been treated as optional until disaster struck. Agent Moore from the FBI contacted me a week after that, with news that made my blood run cold all over again, her voice professional but concerned as she explained what they'd found in Tara's phone records. The contraband phone had been used to contact 3 other women who'd been Tara's cellmates at various times over the past year and a half. All of them released within the past 6 months, and all of them vulnerable in different ways. One was homeless and struggling with addiction. Another was trying to regain custody of her own kids. The third was facing deportation and desperate to stay in the country. Tara had been cultivating relationships with all of them, telling them stories about me and Nora, making promises about money and help with their problems if they'd just do small favors for her once they got out. None of them had actually committed any crimes or helped with the kidnapping, but the pattern showed that Tara was systematically manipulating desperate women and setting up a network of people she could use for whatever schemes she was planning. Moore said the FBI was investigating all of Tara's known associates and contacts to figure out what other plots she might have been working on. And they were concerned that the kidnapping might have been just one part of a larger revenge plan she'd been building for months. I felt sick thinking about how much time and energy Tara had put into hurting us, how she'd spent her days in prison not reflecting on her crimes or trying to become better, but instead plotting ways to destroy what was left of my life and use our daughter as a weapon. 2 weeks after the rescue, I found a letter in my mailbox with a return address I didn't recognize, the envelope thick and the handwriting careful and neat. Inside was a 3-page letter from Tara's parents, people I hadn't spoken to since right after her arrest, when they'd made it clear they thought I was partly to blame for their daughter's choices. They wrote that they were horrified by what Tara had done, that they'd had no contact with her since her conviction, because they couldn't support or enable her behavior anymore, and they were devastated to learn she'd used their granddaughter as a weapon in some twisted revenge scheme. They offered to pay for Nora's therapy sessions, all of them for as long as she needed help, and they asked if they could maybe see her sometimes under whatever conditions I felt comfortable with, because they missed her and wanted to be part of her life even though their daughter had proven herself unfit to be a mother. I sat at the kitchen table reading the letter 3 times, feeling torn between anger at them for raising someone capable of what Tara had done and sympathy for their obvious pain at losing both their daughter and their granddaughter to Tara's choices. I talked it over with Dr. Aguirre at our next session, and she helped me see that accepting their financial help didn't mean forgiving them or forgetting their past behavior. It just meant letting them do something positive for Nora when she needed support. I called them that evening and accepted their offer to cover therapy costs, and we talked carefully about maybe arranging supervised visits once Nora was doing better, keeping things simple and structured so nobody got hurt. Diane's sentencing hearing arrived 6 weeks after her arrest, the courthouse busy with other cases and lawyers moving through hallways with briefcases and serious expressions. The prosecutor found me in the waiting area outside the courtroom and asked if I wanted to give a victim impact statement, explaining that the judge would consider my words. When deciding Diane's sentence, and it might help to hear directly from us about how the kidnapping had affected our family. I struggled with the decision because part of me wanted to stand up and describe every nightmare Nora had suffered, every moment of terror I'd felt, every way this had damaged our sense of safety and trust. But another part of me remembered Diane's face when she realized Tara had lied to her, the genuine remorse in her voice when she apologized, the way she'd surrendered instead of hurting Nora when she understood the truth. I finally decided to give a statement that acknowledged both things, the real harm she'd caused and the fact that she'd been manipulated and used by someone who was very good at lying and manipulation. I stood at the podium in the courtroom with my prepared notes shaking in my hands, and I described Nora's nightmares and anxiety, the therapy sessions, and the fear that would probably stay with her for years, the way a simple school pickup had turned into every parent's worst nightmare. But I also said that Diane had been Tara's victim too in a different way, that she'd been fed lies and false promises by someone who'd spent months studying how to manipulate her, and that her choice to surrender and cooperate when she learned the truth showed she wasn't beyond redemption. I asked the judge for justice but not vengeance, for a sentence that held Diane accountable, while recognizing that the real villain in this story was the woman who'd orchestrated everything from her prison cell. The judge listened carefully to my statement and to Diane's lawyer's arguments about her cooperation and remorse, and after a brief recess, he came back with his decision. He sentenced Diane to 5 years in prison with credit for the time she'd already served, and possibility of parole after 3 years, citing her genuine remorse and full cooperation with investigators as reasons for some leniency, even though kidnapping was a serious crime that deserved serious consequences. Diane stood when the sentence was read, her orange jumpsuit hanging loose on her thin frame, and before the bailiff could lead her away, she turned to look directly at me. Tears were streaming down her face as she said she'd never forgive herself for scaring Nora, and she hoped that someday we could both find a way to heal from what she'd done. I nodded once to show I heard her, but didn't say anything back, still working through my own complicated feelings about her role in this nightmare, about how much blame she deserved versus how much belonged to Tara. The bailiff let her out through a side door, and I left the courthouse feeling drained, but glad the legal process was moving forward, that at least one person was being held accountable, even if the main architect of the whole scheme was still waiting for her own trial. Nora's therapy sessions with Dr. Aguirre happened twice a week in a comfortable office with toys and art supplies, and over the following weeks she slowly started opening up about feelings she'd been keeping inside. During one session about a month after the kidnapping, Dr. Aguirre gently asked Nora if she ever thought about why her mom had done what she did, and my daughter's answer broke my heart into pieces. She said she thought maybe she'd made her mommy so mad that her mommy had to do something bad, that maybe if she'd been a better daughter or hadn't said something wrong, then none of this would have happened. Dr. Aguirre spent the rest of that session and several more working with both of us to help Nora understand that adults were responsible for their own choices, and kids were never to blame for their parents' actions, that loving her mother didn't mean accepting or excusing what Tara had done. We practiced phrases Nora could use when she felt scared or guilty, simple statements like "it's not my fault" or "I'm allowed to feel safe" or "grown-ups make their own choices." The progress was slow and gradual, some days better than others, but over time I started seeing real changes in how Nora talked about what happened and how she handled the memories. She still had nightmares sometimes, but less often, and she was slowly learning to separate her love for the idea of having a mother from the reality of who Tara actually was and what she'd chosen to do. 3 months after the abduction, Agent Moore called with news that the federal grand jury had handed down their indictment against Tara, and the list of charges was longer than I'd expected. Conspiracy to commit kidnapping, using interstate commerce facilities in commission of a felony, bribery of a federal prison guard, wire fraud related to the forged documents, and several other counts I didn't fully understand, but that Moore explained would each carry serious prison time. She said that between Tara's original embezzlement sentence and these new charges, my ex-wife was looking at an additional 10 to 15 years in federal prison, meaning she wouldn't be eligible for release until Nora was in her 20s and old enough to make her own choices about whether to have contact. The news brought a grim sort of satisfaction, knowing that Tara would face real consequences for using our daughter as a weapon. But it didn't erase the harm that had already been done, or take away Nora's nightmares, or my own constant worry about what other schemes Tara might dream up even from behind bars. I didn't wait for their clearance, couldn't wait another second, my body moving on pure instinct as I pushed past the tactical team and lunged toward the doorway where my daughter stood just inside the room, looking small and scared, and so incredibly precious. Nora saw me and her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks as she broke free from Diane's loose grip and ran into my arms with a force that nearly knocked me backward. She was asking why everyone was crying, why the police were here, if she was in trouble for leaving school with Aunt Diane, her words tumbling out in a rush between hiccuping sobs that made my own throat close up with emotion I struggled to contain. The relief hit me like a physical blow, so intense and overwhelming that my legs buckled beneath me, and I sank to my knees on the rough concrete with Nora still clutched tight in my arms, my hands running over her hair and back to confirm she was real and solid and safe. She smelled like chocolate and cheap motel soap. Her pigtails were coming loose, and there was ice cream dried on her uniform collar. But she was here, and whole, and alive, and nothing else mattered in that moment, as I held her and tried to stop shaking long enough to reassure her that everything would be okay. Behind us, officers were handcuffing Diane while she sobbed and apologized, her mascara-streaked face a mess of regret and confusion as they read her rights and secured the scene with efficient movements that barely registered through the roaring in my ears. Detective Carlson appeared beside us, his large hand gentle on my shoulder as he spoke in a low voice about needing to get Nora checked out by paramedics, about making sure she wasn't hurt or drugged or traumatized beyond what we could see on the surface. I nodded without really hearing him, still running my hands over Nora's arms and legs like I could find some injury I'd missed, some sign that this nightmare had left permanent damage on my little girl. The detective helped me stand, supporting my elbow when my legs wobbled, and guided us toward the ambulance that had pulled into the parking lot with lights flashing but no siren, the red and white colors painting the dingy motel in garish brightness. Nora clung to my neck with both arms wrapped tight, her legs around my waist like she used to do. When she was smaller, when she still believed I could protect her from anything scary in the world, before Tara's arrest had shattered that innocent trust. The paramedics examined Nora in the ambulance while I held her hand, and she seemed physically fine but confused about why the fun afternoon with Aunt Diane ended with police cars and crying grown-ups. She asked if Aunt Diane was going to jail like her mom, and I struggled to find age-appropriate words to explain what happened without making her more scared than she already was. Detective Carlson approached with his notepad ready to get Nora's statement, but I stopped him immediately, my voice firm despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle as I insisted we wait for a child psychologist because she'd already been through enough today. At the police station 2 hours later, a woman named Mariana arrived to interview Nora in a comfortable room with toys. And soft lighting and through the one-way glass, I watched my daughter explain how Aunt Diane knew everything about her favorite foods and her stuffed animals' names and the special song her mom used to sing at bedtime. Nora described the ice cream they'd gotten, chocolate chip mint in a waffle cone, and how Diane told stories about being her mom's best friend in prison, about all the things they talked about and planned together. Nora said Diane promised they would see her mom soon if she was good, and didn't ask too many questions. That this was a special secret surprise that would make everyone happy if Nora just trusted her and went along with the plan. While Nora was interviewed, Detective Carlson showed me evidence they'd collected from Diane's motel room, including a notebook with detailed information about our daily routines, my work schedule, and Nora's school activities written in careful handwriting with dates going back weeks. There were printed photos of Nora from the past year that someone must have taken from outside our house or at the school playground, and the realization that we'd been watched for so long made my skin crawl with revulsion and fear. Diane gave a full confession in the interrogation room next door, her lawyer present but barely speaking, as she poured out everything about how Tara recruited her during their 10 months sharing a cell. She explained that Tara spent months teaching her mannerisms and speech patterns and family history, promising that my ex-wife's wealthy family would pay them both once we returned Nora, and exposed my supposed parental alienation. Diane believed Tara's story that I had stolen money and turned Nora against her mother, that this was about reuniting a loving mother with her child while getting justice for crimes I'd supposedly committed. The federal prosecutor joined our meeting because Diane crossed state lines with Nora, making this a kidnapping case under federal jurisdiction that would involve additional charges and complications. Agent Moore from the FBI explained they'd be adding charges against Tara for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, using a communication device to facilitate a felony, and potentially witness tampering if they could prove she coached Diane on how to deceive authorities. 4 months after the rescue, the prison allowed me to participate in a recorded interview with Tara, conducted by federal investigators, and I watched via video link from a conference room as they questioned her about the kidnapping plot she'd orchestrated from her cell. Tara showed no remorse whatsoever, insisting she had every right to see her daughter and that I was the real criminal for turning Nora against her through lies and manipulation. Her complete lack of insight into the trauma she caused our child was chilling to witness, the way she twisted everything to make herself the victim, and me the villain, and it reinforced my determination to terminate her parental rights permanently so she could never hurt Nora again. Financial stress mounted as therapy bills accumulated alongside legal fees for the custody case, and I was forced to take on extra freelance work to cover expenses, despite Nora's grandparents' help with therapy costs that kept climbing every week. I was exhausted from working late after Nora went to bed and constantly worried about money, checking my bank account multiple times a day and calculating whether I could afford groceries and gas and all the other expenses that kept piling up. A coworker learned about my situation when I fell asleep at my desk one afternoon and organized a small fundraiser at our office that raised several $1,000s from people who barely knew our story but wanted to help anyway. The unexpected support from colleagues moved me to tears in the break room, reminding me that accepting help wasn't weakness, but rather allowing others to show they cared about what we'd been through. Nora returned to the school 4 weeks after the incident with a safety plan in place that included check-ins with the counselor twice a day and permission to call me anytime she felt anxious or scared. Her teacher was patient and understanding about the accommodations, and her classmates welcomed her back with handmade cards and drawings that covered our refrigerator in a colorful collage of support. Slowly, Nora's confidence rebuilt as normal routines resumed and nothing bad happened during the school day, each safe pickup proving to her anxious brain that she was actually protected now, and the scary thing was truly over. The family court hearing for termination of parental rights took place 6 months after the abduction, with Mariana testifying about the psychological harm Tara's actions caused Nora and the ongoing trauma symptoms she continued to experience. Tara appeared via video from prison and used her time to rant about my supposed crimes, and insist she was a victim of a corrupt system that had stolen her daughter, never once expressing concern for how Nora was doing or acknowledging the fear she'd caused. The judge looked disgusted by her performance and took only 20 minutes to deliberate before terminating Tara's parental rights permanently, citing clear and convincing evidence of unfitness and harm to the child that made restoration of rights impossible. After the termination hearing, Nora asked if this meant her mom wasn't her mom anymore, her small voice uncertain as we sat in the parking lot before driving home. I carefully explained that I was her only legal parent now, but she could still have whatever feelings she had about Tara, that loving someone and being safe from them could exist at the same time. Mariana had prepared us for this conversation during therapy sessions, and Nora seemed more relieved than sad, saying she felt safer knowing her mom couldn't make plans about her anymore or send people to take her away. We celebrated that night with her favorite dinner and a movie, marking the end of one difficult chapter and the beginning of a new one where she could just be a kid without fear. Principal Brand invited me to present the new security protocols to the school board and parent association 2 weeks later, and I shared our story to emphasize why these changes mattered and couldn't be treated as optional anymore. Several parents approached me afterward to thank me for speaking up and share their own concerns about school security that they'd been afraid to voice before someone else broke the silence. The school district adopted our elementary school's new protocols system-wide within a month, meaning Nora's trauma had led to protections for thousands of children across the district who would never know how close they'd come to similar danger. Tara's federal trial began 8 months after the abduction, and I was called to testify about the impact on Nora and our family in front of a jury that listened with serious faces. Facing Tara across the courtroom was surreal after everything she'd put us through, and she stared at me with such hatred that I understood she would never change or feel remorse for what she'd done. I gave clear, factual testimony about the abduction and its aftermath, describing Nora's nightmares and anxiety and the therapy sessions that continued twice a week, and the jury seemed moved by the evidence of how she manipulated Diane and traumatized our daughter for revenge. During the trial, I realized I'd been carrying guilt about not protecting Nora better, not seeing the surveillance happening, and not somehow preventing Tara's scheme despite having no way to know about it. Mariana helped me work through this misplaced responsibility in my own therapy sessions that I'd started attending, and I gradually accepted that I did everything a reasonable parent could do and that Tara's actions were beyond my control. Forgiving myself was harder than I expected, but necessary for moving forward, for being the parent Nora needed instead of drowning in what-ifs and self-blame that served no purpose. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including Tara's phone records, showing dozens of calls to Diane, surveillance photos from the notebook, and recordings of Tara's calls coaching Diane on the impersonation with specific instructions about mannerisms and speech patterns. Tara's defense attorney tried to argue she was just trying to see her daughter and didn't intend real harm, but the jury saw through this after hearing about the ransom demand and Tara's unrepentant statements during her prison interview. The trial lasted 2 weeks with witness after witness describing the calculated nature of the plot, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts that would add significant time to her existing sentence. At sentencing, the federal judge added 12 years to Tara's existing sentence to be served consecutively, meaning she wouldn't be eligible for release until Nora was in her mid-20s and old enough to make her own choices. The judge stated clearly that using a child as an instrument of revenge from prison demonstrated exceptional depravity and required a sentence that protected the child and deterred others from similar schemes. I felt a weight lift knowing Nora would grow up without fear of her mother's interference, that by the time Tara was released, Nora would be an adult who could decide for herself whether to have any contact with the woman who'd caused her so much pain. 1 year after Tara's sentencing, I sat in the familiar waiting room of Dr. Aguirre's office with Nora beside me, her legs swinging from the chair as she colored in a workbook she'd brought along, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows and making patterns on the carpet that she tried to trace with her pencil. This was our follow-up evaluation, the one-year check-in that Dr. Aguirre had scheduled back when Nora first started therapy, and everything felt impossible and broken beyond repair. Dr. Aguirre called us back into her office, and Nora bounced ahead of me, no longer hesitant or scared about these visits like she'd been in those early months when every appointment felt like pulling teeth. The therapist smiled at both of us as we settled into our usual spots, Nora curling up in the big armchair she loved, while I took the couch across from Dr. Aguirre's desk. She pulled out her notes and started reviewing Nora's progress over the past year, her voice warm and encouraging as she described the remarkable changes she'd witnessed in my daughter. Nora still had nightmares sometimes, maybe once or twice a month now instead of every single night like those first terrible weeks. And she still got anxious in certain situations like when I was late picking her up or when unexpected changes happened to her routine. But Dr. Aguirre explained that Nora had developed really healthy coping strategies for managing those moments, things like deep breathing exercises and positive self-talk, and knowing when to ask for help instead of trying to handle everything alone. The report continued with details about how well Nora was doing in the school, her grades solid, and her teacher reporting no behavioral concerns and how she'd formed close friendships with 3 girls in her class who didn't know anything about what happened and just saw her as a regular kid. Most importantly, Dr. Aguirre said, Nora had learned to talk about her feelings instead of bottling them up the way she used to, expressing when she felt scared or sad or angry instead of pretending everything was fine until she exploded or shut down completely. I felt proud tears starting in my eyes as I listened to this assessment, remembering how far we'd come from that terrifying day at the motel when I thought I might never get my daughter back safely. Dr. Aguirre recommended we continue therapy, but reduce it to once a month instead of twice a week, a maintenance schedule that would let Nora keep processing things as they came up without making therapy the center of her life anymore. 15 months after the kidnapping, we moved to a new neighborhood across town, packing up our old house with its bad memories, and surveillance photos and starting fresh in a community where nobody knew our story, and Nora could just be a regular kid without whispers or pitying looks. I'd spent weeks house hunting, looking for a place that felt safe but not like a fortress. Somewhere that had good schools and friendly neighbors, and enough distance from our old life that we could breathe easier. The new house was a small 2-story with a fenced backyard and an alarm system that I'd had professionally installed before we even moved our furniture in, the kind with sensors on every door, and window and a panic button in both our bedrooms that would bring police if we ever needed them. Nora loved picking out decorations for her new room, choosing bright yellow paint for the walls and posters of her favorite soccer players, and a bookshelf that we assembled together one Saturday afternoon while listening to music and eating pizza. She wanted everything to look different from her old room, she told me, not because the old room was bad, but because this was a fresh start, and she wanted it to feel new and happy and completely hers. The first day at her new school made me nervous, worried she'd struggle to make friends or feel like an outsider. But Nora came home that afternoon talking excitedly about 2 girls named Emma and Sophia, who'd invited her to sit with them at lunch and asked if she wanted to try out for the soccer team together. Within a month, she had a whole friend group, kids who knew nothing about Tara or the abduction or any of the trauma we'd survived. And I watched in amazement as my daughter laughed and played and acted like a normal 9-year-old without the weight of everything she'd been through holding her down. Her resilience stunned me sometimes, the way she could trust new people and open herself up to new experiences, despite everything that had happened, and I realized she was teaching me how to move forward instead of staying stuck in fear and anger. 3 months into our new life, Nora's grandparents reached out through their lawyer, asking if they could have supervised visits to maintain a relationship with their granddaughter. Their letter carefully worded and apologetic about their daughter's actions while expressing how much they missed Nora. I talked it over with Dr. Aguirre during one of our sessions, uncertain whether letting them back into our lives would help or hurt Nora's continued healing. The therapist pointed out that Nora had expressed curiosity about her mom's side of the family, asking questions about her grandmother and grandfather and whether they were mad at her for what happened, and that having some connection to them might actually help her process her feelings about that whole part of her identity. After careful consideration and setting very clear boundaries, I agreed to occasional meetings in neutral locations like parks or restaurants, places where I'd be present the whole time and could end the visit if anything felt wrong or uncomfortable. The first visit happened on a sunny Saturday at a park near our new house. Nora's grandmother arriving with a thick photo album tucked under her arm and her grandfather carrying a picnic basket full of snacks. The beginning was awkward, everyone unsure what to say or how to act, but Nora's grandmother started showing her baby pictures and telling stories about when Nora was born, about her first steps and her first words and family traditions that had nothing to do with Tara or her crimes. Nora listened with wide eyes, seeing herself as part of a bigger family story that she'd been disconnected from for so long, and she asked questions about great-grandparents she'd never met and cousins she barely remembered. Her grandfather was quieter but kind, offering Nora cookies and asking about her new school and her soccer team without pushing or trying too hard. The visit lasted 2 hours and ended with hugs and promises to do it again soon. And on the drive home, Nora said she was glad she got to see them because they seemed really nice, and it felt good to know more about where she came from. The visits became a monthly tradition over the following year, always supervised and always in public places. But they gave Nora a connection to her extended family that existed separate from her mother's toxicity and helped her understand that she could love parts of her heritage without accepting or excusing what Tara had done. 2 years after the abduction, Nora and I were doing really well in our new life. Better than I'd ever imagined possible during those dark early months when everything felt broken and scary. She was excelling in 5th grade, bringing home report cards full of A's and B's and teacher comments about what a pleasure she was to have in class, and she'd made the competitive soccer team that practiced 3 times a week and traveled to tournaments on weekends. Her friend group was solid, 4 girls who were always at our house for sleepovers or movie nights, and she rarely mentioned the incident anymore, except during her monthly therapy sessions when something would trigger a memory she needed to process. I'd been promoted at work 6 months earlier, a raise and new responsibilities that finally gave us financial stability after years of struggling to cover legal fees and therapy bills and all the other costs that came with rebuilding our lives. The extra money meant I could actually save for Nora's college fund and take her on a real vacation instead of just scraping by paycheck to paycheck. I'd even started dating someone, a woman named Jessica, who worked in my building and who Nora really liked because she was funny and didn't try too hard to be her new mom or replace anyone. We still had security measures in place and probably always would, the alarm system and the careful vetting of anyone new in our lives, and the emergency plans we'd practiced until they were second nature. But those things had become background habits now, rather than constant reminders of trauma that kept us living in fear. Last week during her therapy session, Nora told Dr. Aguirre that she felt lucky to have a dad who fought so hard to keep her safe, who never gave up during the scariest moments, and who'd been there for every nightmare and every anxiety attack and every small victory along the way to healing. Dr. Aguirre shared that comment with me afterward, and I cried in the parking lot, overwhelmed by gratitude that we'd made it through something that could have destroyed us completely. We didn't just survive what Tara did to us, we actually built something stronger and better from the wreckage, creating a life that was peaceful and happy and entirely ours, free from manipulation and fear and the shadow of someone who'd tried to use love as a weapon. Our life wasn't perfect because no life ever is, but it was good and safe and full of possibilities. And every morning when Nora came downstairs for breakfast with her backpack ready for school and a smile on her face, I felt grateful for the second chance we'd been given to just be a normal family doing normal things without looking over our shoulders or waiting for the next crisis to hit.